Hey folks, this is Craig with a quick announcement before we start today. The Acid Horizon Research Commons is running the final class of our summer series beginning August 4th. It's Emma Stam's Anti-Civilization: Recovering from Industry and Progress. The course spans over 5 Tuesday evening sessions, and Emma is going to take us from the primitivist critique of civilization through John Zerzan and Michel Foucault and other theorists, and finally, what anti-civ looks like in actual practice. If you'd like to register for the course, just drop down in the show notes and find the relevant link. We want to thank everyone who supported and participated in the AHRC's summer courses. Most of them are now in our online course archive. Patrons get discounts on the archive, and we hold a limited number of reserved seats for those who want to access free of charge. Your support helps us expand what AHRC can do in the future. And if you become a patron, you will also get exclusive episodes, like last week's discussion with Adam, with more planned for next week and beyond. Okay, let's look back on the life and philosophical legacy of Alexandre Kojève. Let's listen. And I've read, this is actually the second philosophical biography that I've read this month. I read the one put out in the Critical Live series on reaction books about Baudrillard for the episode that we're doing next week. And then I finally got around to Alexandre Kojève, an intellectual biography by Boris Groys, sent to us by Anthony at Verso. Thank you, Anthony. This book was fantastic. Now I'm so into the philosophical biography that I'm looking for the next one. So if you're listening to this, I would say just reach out and comment wherever you're listening and just pop it in. I've read Intersecting Lives. What's the next one that I got to read? But I mean, Adam, you had more familiarity with Kojève than I did before reading this. So what was your basic take on it?
I mean, you have to remember it is specifically an intellectual biography, and that is why it's so rich for people who want to understand something about Kojève, because the thing is about Kojève is he never fucking publishes anything. And I know people who have tried to publish translations of Kojève's works, and the Kojève estate does not want you to publish anything. They are very, very particular about what gets published. It's a miracle that some of his works on authority and on Kant have been published by presses like Verso. And so this book actually gives us a lot of insight into the sort of stuff which only scholars have really had access to. And additionally, only scholars who might know German, Russian, or both when it comes to Kojève. So it really does give you access to his text in a way that really, in English, we haven't had access to before, particularly the texts such as Sophia, Philosophia, and Phenomenologia, where he basically talks about his kind of all but obvious appreciation / love of Stalinism at the time. And then we can sort of okay, what the fuck was this guy's obsession was? What was the obsession with Stalin that led him to write this very strange book that was ultimately one of the most influential things, not only on French philosophy, but also on strands of liberal thought. Thinking about, I mean, the most famous one of this is Francis Fukuyama, his End of History and the Last Man, which, it says it's based on Hegel, but ultimately it is mediated through Kojève. The idea of the end of history really comes into sort of intellectual prominence or intellectual discourse through Kojève. And he's someone who, without him, we wouldn't have the history of modern French philosophy or modern intellectual discourse in the 20th century, to be honest. He is very much central, not only as a literary figure, because it's quite funny, he didn't publish a lot, but he's also central as a political figure in terms of his playing an early part in the formation of the European Commission that would also go to form the European Union. His influence on everyone from Lacan, Bataille, Sartre, Quinault, which we might suggest later on, Deleuze, Caillois, Derrida. Althusser. I mean, so many people went to Kojève's lectures. And there's just something interesting in the idea of an intellectual biography of actually showing how these ideas developed. And I wouldn't say entirely uncritically. I wouldn't say this is necessarily a pro-Kojève book in the way that a biography allows you, I guess, sometimes to navigate some of the more interesting, or let's say not entirely like, isn't the book essentially it's saying Kojève was right or wrong? I mean, it definitely points towards some limits in his work, which is what good intellectual biography should do. And we will probably cover a lot of those limits today. For example, the Stalinism. But I know I really enjoyed this book. I thought it was really well written. You do get to see a lot of your favorites popping up here, and you do get an insight into this quite esoteric thought, which is not esoteric in content, but purely esoteric because of the fact that so little of it was ever published. And yet it was nonetheless influential through his talks with so many others that we read all the time today.
I might have to disagree with you slightly there, because I think this is extremely esoteric in that Kojève formulates his philosophy in distinction to his mentor, Solovyov, by basically eviscerating the Christian core of Solovyov's philosophy and implanting this secular nothingness, which I think in some ways is even more Gnostic and esoteric than leaving Christianity there, which we will find out in the end, ironically, kind of creeps back into Kojève's philosophy. But another interesting factoid about Kojève was that he was the nephew of the painter Kandinsky, which I thought was interesting, which of course is mentioned at the end of this book, and maybe we'll get into that a little bit. But you and I decided to kind of plot some points and talk about some of the book. We don't want to give everything away because, like I said, I'm not just saying this to big up Anthony or Verso and everybody else. This book is fantastic. It's concise, it's thorough, and without being exhaustive, I think gives you an adequate picture of who Kojève was, at least in terms of his thought and philosophy. But I think the first thing that we'll probably talk about is the end of history, perhaps, and the struggle for recognition and what we understand, well, I should say, what the French communists or the French philosophical milieu of the 1930s understood Hegel to be was by and large Kojève's Hegel. And the one thing that he picks out from Hegel's philosophy is the struggle for recognition vis-a-vis the master-slave dialectic. And I think, Adam, I mean, since you're a Hegel scholar, maybe we can just talk about for a little bit, to what extent does he express fidelity towards Hegel? And where's the novelty introduced in Kojève's take on Hegel?
I mean, for me, the novelty of Kojève's take on Hegel, because, I mean, let's just start with the fact that Kojève was not the only sort of big name thinker or someone making a name for himself in France in the early 20th century by giving lectures on Hegel. The most famous sort of scholar of Hegel at the time was Jean Hippolyte, where he wrote these books, Logic and Existence, and the genesis and structure of Hegel's phenomenology of spirit. I believe he might even have translated the phenomenology of spirit into French. There was also, I think, Alexandre Kojève as well, who some people can often get confused with Kojève. But with Kojève, the most influential part of his thought is this centering of the master-slave dialectic. And indeed, it's, as I think Groys points this out, its presentation as a dialectic of specifically master and slave. Okay, so the master-slave dialectic is the following. Two beings exist that need recognition from each other. They fight each other to the death. One of them actually surrenders and becomes the servant, or in Kojève's case, the slave of the other. The other one becomes the master. One of them is recognized by the slave, but the other one doesn't give that recognition back because the master thinks he is above the slave and therefore doesn't have to recognize them. Why doesn't he have to recognize them? Because he's above them. Why is he above them? Because he won the fight, because he can kill them. The master represents death to the slave. Now, Hegel says that under ideal conditions, this really doesn't work unless the recognition between the two of them is mutual, right? Because the master may get recognition from the slave, but the master doesn't actually recognize the slave as being of any importance to them whatsoever. So the recognition they get back from the slave ultimately means nothing. And for all of their independence, for the master thinks they're above it all, but actually they need the slave. The slave is the most important thing in this equation, and therefore is the most essential thing. Therefore, the truth of this ultimately is that mastery is actually a form of dependence. A mastery is failed upon its own terms. So they're dependent on the slave for their recognition. Whereas the slave, according to Hegel, can actually get a sense of themselves through service, through work. They make dinner for the master. They see the ways in which they are changing nature. And then through the objects of their work, it's reflecting their own humanity back to them. Now, Kojève is going to take this and say, look, mutual recognition, this dialectic of master and slave, basically structures all of human history. And it's going to end when we have a universal state where everyone will work for each other and therefore recognize each other. And yet at the same time, everybody will also be a master. They will be the master of their own fate. They will not be a slave to anybody, but will nonetheless mutually work and support each other, becoming both a synthesis of master and slave, fully self-conscious beings. Now, at the time that he's arguing this, he thinks this is the Stalinist Soviet Union, where workers are maximally conscious of their own class position, and yet nonetheless, they are in a worker's state. They are the master of their state, as mediated by Stalin, and yet they are all working collectively for each other. He thinks that's the solution to the dialectic. Now, when it comes to the master-slave dialectic in Kojève, how it structures history is based on one of the main questions for Kojève, if anything, the question, which is, what is a human being? Now, there's a point that Kojève takes from Hegel, and I'm not really going to say much at this point about where I think this is a good reading of Hegel. It's one of the most influential readings of Hegel, and that's probably more important at this point. He thinks, and Hegel also thinks this to some extent, is that humans are full of negativity. They are creatures that can negate themselves. They're creatures that, for Kojève, they can hurt themselves. They can kill themselves even. By showing that you can hurt yourself, that you can negate your immediate being, Kojève and Hegel both think that's because that we ultimately think there's something on the other side of that negation. If we might die for a cause, it's because we think some part of our work lives on in that cause. When we understand our limitations as finite mortal beings, we can therefore see what's on the other side. And because what's on the other side is thinkable for us, it's an object for us, we can therefore posit a corresponding subject on the other side of it. Because we can think of the other side, we can think of us as thinking the other side, on that side. And so Kojève is going to take this idea and say that humans will enter this dialectic of struggle for recognition because they want to find themselves on the other side of death. And they're going to start fighting with each other. They're going to be enslaved by each other because people are going to constantly transform themselves into almost like a new kind of immortality, a new form of life on the other side of death. And he thinks the history is basically it's not a linear progress towards the end of this dialectic. It's just a history of contingent ways in which we've tried to escape death through the process of being recognized. We're going up to the world and saying, you can't kill me. You can't kill me because you will only make me more powerful than you can possibly imagine. It's an Obi-Wan Kenobi theory of Hegelian recognition. If you've seen Star Wars, listeners, and so the end of history is going to be like the total recognition of everyone, when everybody has mutually understood that each person only exists for each other, and the way that he frames this, Kojève, borrowing it from Hegel. This is one of the most influential things about this, right? Is that the desire for mutual recognition is a desire to be recognized, not by yourself, but by someone else. You want someone else to want you. You want someone else to see you for what you think you are, but cannot necessarily prove yourself to be. You want to prove yourself to the other. You want to desire the other's desire. So we'll notice that Lacan goes to these seminars, this idea of that you desire the other's desire. The problem with getting what you want is you can't want it anymore. Whereas if you want someone else's desire, another person wants your desire for recognition can be mutually self-reinforcing. And you can demonstrate that to each other by working for each other. Hegel defines work as the following: desire held in check. And this is a way in which, if we held our desire in check, we can actually negate ourselves. We can use the nothingness within us, the negativity within us, to hold each other accountable to each other and to work for each other, to establish new forms of collectivity, and not only as a new form of collective action, but as a new form of self-awareness. Now, the problem, if you achieve this, is that if you end the struggle for recognition, humans still die. And if humans still die, they achieve a sense of themselves as no longer being. They lose their desire for immortality, of a greater sense of their own finitude, their own death. And so if the struggle for recognition has ended, then what's left of humanity? How do you still act in a human way after the struggle, the class struggle, the struggle of history is over? That's going to be Kojève's problem. That was really, really long, but it's a really hard thing to summarize Hegel and then summarize the Hegel parts of that. It's a long book, folks. Not the Kojève, not the Groys.
Maybe just to cover some points that weren't hit upon there, for Kojève, history ends when the workers enter the fight and risk their lives in revolution and then become recognized alongside the masters. And that becomes the condition by which the universal and homogeneous state emerges.
Yeah.
Now, if we're thinking like Marxists, clearly we have not instituted global communism yet. And or if we're thinking like Hegelian Marxists, that is, and therefore this state has not yet been achieved. But for Kojève, the strange thing is, or at least in his first pass at the thesis, is that this has already happened. So the big scandal of history is that history ends with Napoleon at the Battle of Jena. And then everything after that is just an extension in space of the whole Robespierre-Napoleon revolutionary force. This is going to get us on to talking about the role of Stalin and Kojève's analysis of Stalin as a Napoleon-like figure in history. But I just want to press pause on that for a moment, because I think one of the interesting conclusions of this philosophy is that with history already ended, what does that mean for post-humanity, the future of humanity? And I mean, this is going to be a big vector in this conversation, but one of the things, just to sort of briefly preview how we might talk about this, is there is a kind of care that needs to be undertaken in order to preserve the form of the human and formality itself. And where do we find that in the world today? Which cultures exhibit the kind of formality that will allow us to create the methods and form of self-care in post-humanity? Well, for Kojève, interestingly, it's none other than the Japanese. And what he alludes to as a kind of Japanese snobbery is really a commitment to formalized values, but empty of all human content. And this concept of emptiness and just the whole concept of the human as an emptiness, as a nothingness, is something that we're going to return to time and again. But for Kojève, the art forms in traditional Japan, like no theater, sado, the tea ceremony, or shodo, the Japanese form of calligraphy, is one of the ways that we can remain human without history. So basically, the prescription is adopt this sort of Japanified, Japanophilic affect, perhaps even adopting specifically Japanese forms of artistry, but finding within our own cultures ways of doing so. And for Kojève, this sort of Japanophilia is not retrograde. It's not an appropriation, and it's not, as he might say, a rebarbarization of Japan, but it's the Japanization of Western people.
Yeah, the Japan stuff is always interesting to me, because you can see, I mean, Craig already alluded to it, that Kojève thinks at first time he finds the end of history, that it's Stalin. And then he thinks, no, actually, what if it was just Napoleon? Because there's this sort of narrative that Hegel sees the world spirit in Napoleon, who sort of consummates the French Revolution and its sort of rabid, chaotic terror by establishing it as a kind of a new imperial sort of constitution, a new model of statehood, with its own schema of universal legal rights and duties. Hegel is thinking about this, of course, after the fall of the Holy Roman Empire, which is a 1,000-year-long imperial legal system. So to establish a new imperial legal system on top of that with Napoleon, that for him, that's like an epochal sort of consummating moment of a revolution in which freedom sort of comes into its own. And for Hegel, history is just the evolution of freedom. Spoiler, freedom ends in Hegel. People would say that's unfair, actually. I think it's more fair than Hegel deserves. But with the idea of humans as a nothingness, and he thinks, Kojève thinks that humans are fundamentally a nothingness because he's an atheist, but he's also kind of an inverted Christian to that extent. Like he looks at some of the mystical thinkers like Solovyov and says, yeah, I agree that God is kind of the nothingness, non-being, unity of being and non-being, but actually this isn't a positive thing. If you look at it negatively, what God actually is kind of this hole in existence, this pure negativity that is the death of every living being. And humans, he thinks, have an access to nothingness that is engendered by, as I was saying, this fact that we can negate ourselves, that we can kill ourselves, hurt ourselves, and we can try and we can empty ourselves out and render ourselves into a formal content that can be shared about. So, for example, literature, writing books. Kojève, we're speaking about Kojève, but we're referring to a literary canon. The man himself is no longer in existence, if you could argue. And so with stuff like the Japanese sort of ritual customs, what Kojève is talking about is essentially is like, okay, we need these meaningless forms because they are meaningless. We need like these forms in which the animal part of us is treated as dead because we are called to inhabit a position which is completely beyond a human. It doesn't matter what you want with these kinds of codes of etiquette because there is a proper procedure, proper protocol. You can think about this as well as sort of English snobbery, sort of the decline of the upper classes there. And you can really see that Kojève what needs he's trying to find a new place for negativity after he thinks we've kind of done everything as a species. I think he does think that we've kind of done everything.
Yeah, and I think that's really important to point out is that the sort of presiding anxiety for Kojève is the fall. Even though it's a secular philosophy, it has a very theological shape to it. For Kojève, the one danger in post-humanity is falling into animality. And it's arguable that, and we can get into this a little bit towards the end of the discussion, that even the creation of the European Union and the values that were instrumental in shaping the vision for the European Union were directly influenced, not only by Kojève as a person, but this particular idea of a post-humanity and this fall into animality. Kojève traveled all around the world, and he became a photographer of sorts and took thousands of photos. And he traveled both to the United States and the USSR. And as part of his post-historical thesis, he concluded that the American way of life was indicative or the sort of paradigm of post-history. He then comes to revise his position ultimately to say that man's return to animality is and was a certainty that was already present all along. And so in conjunction with this reclamation of the formalities of Japanese culture or the Japanization of Westerners, all of that plays a part in a kind of therapy or a kind of remedy for modernity. But also one of the other sort of underlying issues here is the identity of Europe itself. So with Kojève's original Stalinophilia, and then seeing the United States as being the paradigm of post-history, it raises the question of where does that leave Europe? Because Europe's values for most of modernity, at least in the time of Kojève's life, were either determined by capitalism, of which America was the towering paradigm of capitalism, and communism, which was infused not only with abstract communist values, but carried with it a sort of Russian and Bolshevik accent that was not inherent or intrinsic to the culture of Europe. And so I think what Kojève is trying to do, politically speaking, along his lifeline, is come to grips with the notion that the sort of nothingness that is Europe in modernity has been in the set of pinchers between both East and West. And so it raises the question of how then do we reclaim European values? And then, of course, at the end of Kojève's life, we see this marked shift where he almost pivots back to the religious core that was initially eviscerated from his early philosophy. But not only that, we see a concerted effort to make a reclamation of strictly European values.
Yes, there's Well, I mean, to say that Kojève is a Eurocentric thinker is to say something that's incredibly obvious. I mean, this is not going to be a pro-Kojève podcast. We're not going to say we need to claim European values. I'm not even sure that he would say it's European values at that point. He would say it's like Catholic values, Latin values.
Well, I mean, my take on it was he understood that to reclaim whatever values were important for Europe required creating a coalition between, for example, France, Italy, and Spain, where I can't see it any other way other than to say that I think beyond a shadow of a doubt, what he's trying to do is to create a readout for whatever remains of European values in the reactionary sense. But I think in a more progressive sense, he understands that cannot happen through the national idiom.
Yes, there's a real problem, I think, with Kojève is that in ways he's not a nationalist. He thinks that modernity is defined by sort of a dialect between nationalism and internationalism. But that's why he thinks, okay, let's resolve this dialectic in a third term, which is empires. And he's talking about empires really as well, but especially in the sort of the Holy Roman sense of just big coalition of lands driven by a shared legal system and a shared culture. I mean, he must have been the weirdest guy at those meetings for forming the European Commission. Because you want to take sort of the standard narrative about the formation of it is, it's originally it's like the European Coal and Steel sort of commission. And that's basically so that if we tie the steel and coal industries of France and Germany together, they will not go to war with each other. And then brackets, so they can go to war with Russia, with America, if it comes to it. Whereas he's there talking about, this crisis of values, what if we build a place on a common culture where there's mutual recognition that can, if it's Catholic because it's Spain and France and Italy, then that Catholicity can maybe expand to rejoin up with other empires determined by Christianity, because ultimately he is not just a Eurocentrist, he's a Christocentrist in many ways, because he thinks that the Anglophone empire of, K and US, basically just the US, is sort of Protestantism, Eastern Orthodoxy is the Soviet Union, and Europe is caught in the middle without any sort of binding element that can put it all together. And he sees this division in Europe. It's coming in many ways from the kind of thought that he was reading in Russian. Of course, he was from Russia. He left Russia during sort of the early days of the Russian Revolution, the Soviet period. The questions in Russian intelligentsia at the time were: do we double down on sort of a specifically Russian ethnic identity, of Slavic identity? I mean, specifically Russia in the sense of west of the Urals. I mean, this wasn't the maximally inclusive Russian intelligentsia. Or do you want to follow the trend set by Peter the Great and Catherine the Great and double down on being westernizers, double down on speaking French or not? And it's an interesting thing, actually. You can get a sense that some of the modernizers were more into their Hegel, whereas the Slavophiles were more into their Schelling. You can see that in the German Wikipedia entry on Russian Slavophilia. It's not in the English one, surprisingly. But this division, this question of continent-wide, so empire-wide, concept-wide recognition, religiosity, forms of life really dominate a lot of his thinking. Also provided its limitations, because I don't think he methodologically leaves nationalism. I think he simply expands it and inflates it.
And maybe just another point to add about the whole forms of life thing that we see in Kojève's work. I mean, we've been talking about his atheism, which is essentially Christianity, but with God taken out. It's interesting, a sort of argument that he makes is that he's cleaving pretty close to Solovyov's philosophy, and he wants to preserve many elements of it. But it's interesting because Kojève accepts the concept of immortality, but only as a product of the human imagination. But it's going to be the one that's important for us when it comes time to exist and flourish within post-humanity. Because what he says is, at the end of history, humans will lose the hope of their own personal immortality, but in losing that, they also forget their mortality. And thus they lose the whole philosophical tradition, which is really, for Kojève, nothing but a reflection on death anyway. But the interesting thing is that The replacement for immortality is what he calls the life form. And so, how does post-history or post-humanity proceed? It proceeds through empty masks or personae that survive the carrier and that are then donned by the next generation. So it could be, for example, something like a military uniform or a priest's gown or a nun's habit or what have you. And so insofar as those secularized and ultimately traditional forms and representations have not grown threadbare and have some cultural durability to them, that is the way that we can survive and thrive in post-humanity. And so in that sense, Kojève is a very strange traditionalist.
I mean, I wonder if you ever read Frank Herbert's Dune. I feel like he would have been a big fan of Dune. Shout out Coop, I hear you punch the air all the way from London. But yes, I mean, I think we need to spend a little bit of time talking about Solovyov because we're just mentioning his word. I have never read Solovyov. This is my first time I've had the time properly exposed to it. I would bet that no one has really read Solovyov unless you are a Russian speaker or a Kojève. Only people I've ever known to read Solovyov are Kojève scholars. And I've only ever known two of them. But Solovyov is essentially, he's a Gnostic. He's in many ways kind of a Platonist. He believes that God, as we mentioned before, God is the positive unity of being and nothingness, the maximal reality and the maximal non-reality. He is Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end, everything and nothing. But he's not all of human creativity and knowledge. That is Sophia. Sophia is all of human creativity and knowledge, kind of like, what if as Nietzsche said, what if truth be a woman? What then? That is, it is, if Plato's realm of forms was personified in this sort of feminine mystical figure called Sophia, and then according to Solovyov's sort of Gnostic cosmology, God is in a relationship with Sophia, God loves Sophia, God is a philosopher. Right? God is the philosopher. Why is God a philosopher? As Kojève will say, is because he's the ultimate death. And the ultimate death is therefore the ultimate self-consciousness and is therefore the ultimate philosopher. It's not the best syllogism, but it's basically what Kojève thinks. But what this does for Solovyov is it, and it relates to what you're saying about forms of life, Craig, is because essentially what Sophia is and what he is for Solovyov is she's the bottom of a certain idea, which is for Solovyov, every particular idea has a carrier of this idea for which an idea distinguishes itself from others, right? Now, for Solovyov, that basically means that every idea has a kind of personality, and there people can personify ideas, or ideas are personified as people. We can think about this, the idea of the form of the soul, maybe in Plato, or as I think Groys points out, it's very much the case that Solovyov is reading a lot of Dostoevsky. As they read sort of the Brothers Karamazov or any Dostoevsky, people stand in for ideas most of the time. And with kind of Sophia, the idea is that I think what Kojève is going to take is that people can embody ideas. They can embody forms. They can be carriers of certain forms in the Platonic sense of life. Not simply because the forms are real and exist. He's not a metaphysician, but because they exist in human culture and human imagination. And this creation of these forms that linger beyond death, this drive for immortality, which for him is totally futile, for which we try to be recognized by others to both escape death and then in many ways fulfill our death, that is the whole point of culture and of history, of discourse, as he calls it. And I think that's one of the things he gets from Solovyov, in a way, an imagination that can produce this world of forms like Plato, but without giving it as much of a metaphysical weight, because the only reason we can do that, project out there, is because it's non-existent. Why can we project ourselves beyond ourselves? Because we carry death within ourselves. And we can put that death down. We can make a statement of it, even if we cannot escape it.
You could make this really strange argument where the whole of modern European bureaucracy derives from Solovyov's Gnostic active imagination sessions that he did with the goddess Sophia. Evidently, he wrote love letters to Sophia in which he receive some sort of health advice. And then it's from there that he was able to get the ideas of the form. I mean, even that's interesting in and of itself, is to think, for example, to think philosophically in terms of the forms, and that then having some impact on our notion of bureaucracy, political or otherwise.
Well, this is why I think he loved Stalinism, because I mean, in some sense, he was anti-Trotskyist and anti-social democratic, because he thought that these things always put the revolution at the end of a process which never ends. Whereas with Stalinism, you just have socialism in one country, and then it's just all the forms of human work are recognized and elevated up to the supreme level of state importance, explicitly for all the workers. That was meant to be the point of it. It's the Konovites, these workers who fucking work themselves to the bone, apparently beyond the call of anything, are praised as heroes, kind of the masters of their fate and masters of the state production for which Stalin serves as deputy. For it is, for Kojève, a conservative kind of idealism. Like, I think Boris is very good at pointing this out. Kojève thinks Stalin's a conservative figure.
Yeah.
And that's in ways why he likes him. And it's even to the extent of which he thinks that Stalin brings out everything into the open, everything into discourse. And he thinks this is especially true of the Moscow show trials. He's like, see, isn't this great? There's everyone is denouncing each other and denouncing themselves. Everyone is being maximally self-conscious. And I'm not sure how convinced I am of this by Groys's account. Like,
the book said he walked that back later.
Yeah, well, there's this tension in the book between the philosopher's role for Kojève seems to be to measure up how universal recognition, how post-historical life is going. Now, for Kojève, that's only really expressed in universal terms on the level of how the state is going. So the philosopher's criterion for Kojève after the end of history is, how is the state fulfilling universal recognition? Is it maintaining humanity? Is it maintaining a good kind of humanity which is universal and inclusive of everybody? Does it make people philosophers? Does it make people contemplate their own humanity and their own death, and in such a way that is sort of culturally true, good, and beautiful? But how does one criticize the state then? Kojève actually at one point admits that, okay, yes, well, everyone has to be a philosopher, everyone has to be constantly testing the state, but because we won't be there to see the state fulfill itself totally, we've got to kind of critique it from within the state. Well, he's not stupid. He knows that if you do this in the Stalin Soviet Union, you're basically asking to be shot. But then Kojève's anthropology comes in and he's like, yes, and humans are the only beings that can choose suicide. So a philosopher choosing suicide in the name of criticism is the maximal expression of being a philosopher. And we've seen this narrative for so long, going back to Socrates, of course. He dies to test the virtue of the state. It is in many ways, I think, a fundamentally Platonist worldview that is mediated by Hegel. But I think at the base, you're right, it's Soloviev. Soloviev was his teacher in many ways, because he was fascinated by his works, because his doctoral thesis, I believe, was in Heidelberg under Karl Jaspers on Soloviev, which is
that's right.
Not a figure really anyone had been looking at. And as I understand it, Soloviev is more influenced by Schelling than by Hegel.
I think maybe we'll pivot to talking about some of Kojève's antagonists, including Deleuze, and then his interlocution with Bataille and the way that Bataille adopts some of Kojève's predicates, but then transforms some of them. When I picked up this book for the first time, Adam, I think I had only read the introduction. And then I reached out to you and I said, wow, this immediately takes me right to not only difference and repetition, but I'm thinking specifically of Deleuze's Nietzsche book, where Deleuze has recognition under attack. And it's pretty clear to me, only having, I read The Phenomenology of Spirit maybe more than 25 years ago, and in the introduction maybe twice since then. The emphasis on recognition that we see in Kojève's text is not something that stood out to me when reading Hegel, right? And so when Deleuze attacks the recognition piece, it seems utterly obvious to me that he's going after Kojève, or at least a form of Hegel's thought that was popularized by Kojève. And I thought it would be important to just kind of do a bit of Deleuzean evangelism and kind of walk through Deleuze's argument against that. So the way that Deleuze goes after recognition fundamentally is it attempts to counteract something Kojève tries to do with Hegel's philosophy. Kojève wants to say that nature is not dialectical, but humans are. Deleuze is going to say nature is certainly not a dialectician. Not every relation of the same or other or whatever is dialectical for Deleuze. And everything depends on the role of the negative. Now, for Deleuze, does Deleuze believe in the negative? Well, he does to the extent that it is a derivative product of an active life. It's not something that's a starting condition per se. And this comes from Deleuze's pure positivity, as it were. So when it comes to the negative, it's about it being a practical difference within the philosophy itself, not a speculative negativity. And so adopting Nietzsche's view, Deleuze will say, it's not what is the goal of the will, what is the outcome, what is the future of the will, but what does a particular will want? And how does that will in any given instance affirm its difference? And so it's really just at that point where Deleuze makes a break with the Hegelian conceit and Kojève's version of it, which is affirmation versus dialectical negation, joy versus labor, a kind of lightness versus responsibility. But here's the one challenge that a lot of folks have with Deleuze's idea is that Deleuze asserts a notion of hierarchy here, a hierarchy of wills, but it's not a hierarchy in a kind of preset order of rank. That's big for Deleuze here, is that he's going to dispose with the prefiguration that comes with ordinary versions of hierarchy and the prefiguration of dialectical philosophy, of a philosophy of the absolute. And so for Deleuze, it's that feeling of difference. It's not rank inside a system of recognition. So Deleuze is pivoting away from recognition at every point. And for Deleuze, the question is, who wants the dialectic?
Well, some of us are still Marxists, you know. No, who wants the dialectic? I mean, I always find Deleuze's relationship to Hegel very weird because the difference repetition project is first announced in a review of Jean Hippolyte and not Kojève. He was taught his Hegel by Hippolyte. But you're right. I mean, this entire focus, this overbearing centering of the master-servant dialectic, which mutual recognition is the outcome of all this, which I should have to say, in the phenomenology of spirit, it doesn't happen. He says, it would be nice if it happened, but it doesn't. It simply does not happen. I mean, the closest you get to that is morality, when you just say yes and you cancel out the depth of morality to affirm that sinners and virtuous people were actually part of the same unfolding process, a part of the same community, the same sort of moral substance. But you don't get this mutual recognition thing in Hegel to the extent that you get it in Kojève. But it is so powerful because it does speak to a lot of stuff that people were looking for in Marx as well, thinking about sort of the influence of the master-servant dialectic on the stuff about alienated labour. But when it comes to this Deleuzean point, I mean, there is the question of like, who wants dialectics? Is it the good thing about the master-servant dialectic is that it says it's the slave sort of saying to the master that actually you're just dependent on me. But in the actual Hegelian dialectic, it's the slavery isn't completely abolished. It's sort of transformed into mastery, and mastery is transformed into slavery. The paradigm of civility is sublated. I mean, if you want to be cynical about sublation, you can say that it's the dialectical art of having your cake and then eating it. Because you have your cake in the first negation, and then you negate that negation by then eating it. And then you posit the entire process as the totality of having your cake and then eating it. But I mean, I do think that he is responding to Kojève, which for me is weird. I mean, I don't know. I mean, it's a good foil to introduce Nietzsche, I think, is why. Because I think Deleuze's reading of certain Hegelians, specifically Stirner, is atrocious. I think he's reading some quite atrocious readings of Hegel, Feuerbach's, I think, being one of them. But I don't think that's a good enough response to what Deleuze is trying to say, to be honest, because that's just saying, oh, Hegel didn't really say that. He said far worse things. Like,
well, to be fair, even if we're not attacking a certain version of Hegel, I think Deleuze has a very strong case against Kojève's Hegel. Because the thing that he first of all, he's using master and slave. He's not using bondsman. And maybe that's simply a translational tendency of the time. But for Deleuze, the slave's three errors are conceiving power as an object of recognition. We already got that. We've covered that. Conceiving power as the content of a representation. We might argue that even the preservations of forms and their instantiations has something to do with that. And then power as the stake in a competition within a preset field of coordinates. The whole concept of history and rising up to take on the risk. That's the other thing. I didn't bring this into my notes, but this will just be an on-the-spot riff. In Deleuze's The Mystery of Ariadne, according to Nietzsche, one of the things that he attacks there is the heroic conception of the will and the heroic mode of existence, where the purpose of the hero is to take on the burden, to assume the hero's quest, assume the hero's journey, as it were, and engender the risk that would put their life at stake. All over Deleuze's work, we're seeing this inflection of what the will wants versus a kind of will being recognized. It's everywhere in different forms. But there specifically, I think that maps onto Kojève's conception of the notion that in order to transform history, in order that, for example, the workers would rise up so that they could be recognized alongside their masters. And for Deleuze, that is not the most joyful expression of life. In fact, this is a kind of sad and reactive way of approaching life. And so Deleuze would see the whole of Kojève's notion of history as being a succession of these kind of sad reactive moments, essentially.
Yeah, history is mankind's response to the horror of death. That's Kojève's entire view. We mentioned earlier that for Kojève, nature isn't dialectical, but humans are. That's because humans they contain their death within them. They can kill themselves. That's more or less Kojève's entire point. The anthropogenic fact about humans is that they are mortal, and they can become self-aware as humans, and therefore they can become self-aware of this mortality. Hegel says that at one point there's the subject is the night in the human eye, the night of the world. And Kojève basically thinks that death is more powerful than being. Death is actually more absolute than the natural being. Non-being is primary to all of this. It's why someone like Bataille, which really loves it, is also horrified by it, actually. In his letter to X, he says that if history is over, I will kill myself to refute your system, which I think, if Bataille understood Kojève pretty well, is either a really good way to respond to it or a really bad way to respond to it. Because he might confirm his thesis, or you'll say, see, there is still humanity here because Conrad George has negated his immediate being and proved the power of death. The Bataille and Yasafal guys basically wanted Kojève to be their pope at one point. They were writing stuff about embracing death, but they weren't embracing death because of knowledge. They were embracing death because of non-knowledge. They would define what's outside of what Kojève thought was Hegelian absolute knowledge, which is self-consciousness of the master-servant dialectic and your own desire for recognition and the need for recognition throughout history. And I think the main problem with Kojève is that he is I'm going to say it. I know. The problem with Kojève is that he's a philosopher, and he thinks reality is primarily structured according to a philosopher's view of desire. He thinks that we all yearn for recognition, that we all yearn for immortality, and the same reason that philosophers yearn for immortality. The problem with Hegel's dialectic of master and servitude is it's not a social dialectic, really. It can play out socially, but it's a dialectic of epistemology. It's about the desire for knowledge, and that desire for knowledge structures everything else. Now, are humans simply made in the image of philosophy? Like, you can pull out some Laruelle. Big up Jeremy. Pull up some Laruelle here. Are humans simply as they exist for thought and for philosophy? If you're going to take this sort of Platonic metaphysics from Solovyov, they kind of have to be bearers of ideas more than themselves, and they have to confront their finitude in philosophical terms, which, if you do, you end up sort of verifying into national thoughts, national essences, collective thoughts, and you get back to Hegelian Volksgeist stuff, and you want to create an empire like the EU to maintain one of those, because you think it's all about the plays of those collective recognitions in the form of empires. But that leaves aside the obvious point, which is these fuckers already have empires. Europe already has an empire. People at Aimé Césaire are writing at this point, being like, talking to some of Kojève's students, like Carrois, and they're saying, you fucking motherfuckers, you were thrown into existential crisis by Hitler. We've been having your Hitler-esque bullshit being thrown at us for goddamn centuries. We wouldn't mind recognition, fine. But given what you think human being is and how you treat us, why could you give us recognition? You've already completely dehumanized yourselves. He's a sad white boy in Paris, just having loads of fun drinking wine and eating delicious food. And he's like, oh God, no, history is over. My steak is too juicy. My Stalin too cool. Like there is something a bit funny about this being the problem. Like Bataille's running around being like, fuck, there's going to be a nuclear war. Everyone needs to give all their money to India and stop spending it on bombs. Kojève's just like, I think matcha might be the way to solve the end of history. Like Kojève, if he got to the UK and saw that we had matcha in Greggs, right, I think he'd be fine. I think he'd just put the pen down.
I think a more interesting pivot here is to talk about some of the overlap between Kojève and Bataille. And as I was finishing up the book, it had occurred to me the quote that we see at the top of Bataille's The Sacred Conspiracy, where Bataille writes, "That which had a political face and imagined itself political will unmask itself one day and reveal itself to be a religious movement." And this is a quote from Kierkegaard. And Bataille is writing this for Asafel as a way to introduce the thesis of the sacred conspiracy. And we could easily say that this is an idea or a commitment that he never abandoned in his relationship or even in his criticism of Kojève's work, that there is this sort of secularized politics that has this religious yearning just simmering beneath the surface all the way until the end of their philosophical lives. I mean, we see it in Bataille's work, and clearly we see it in Kojève's work.
Yeah, Bataille wants to put humanity on the other side of absolute knowledge. He has to kind of presuppose it. And I think Derrida, in an essay like From Restricted to General Economy, from his book Writing and Difference, is very good at pointing out the relationship between Bataille and Hegel. But Bataille, I mean, especially in the Asafal days, they wanted to create a communist Nietzschean religion to defeat fascism. But the project collapsed when fascism ended up invading France before this weird project of religious communism could play out. But he does clearly take some stuff from Kojève. I mean, I think his atheism is quite Kojèvian. Yeah. In that, if you look at an essay like The Absence of Myth, listeners, it's one page. I would recommend it. It says the absence of myth is itself the greatest myth, because he thinks that actually at the ground of all our mythologies, there is this void at the heart of being, what he calls continuity of being. He thinks that we are all discontinuous beings, we're all like separated out from each other, but when we die, we become continuous. Death is what continues life. For example, killing an animal and eating it. You separate the bounds between two beings when one eats another, and there's a continuity between them. Death fertilizes the ground and therefore provides the continuity of life. If anything, there's something of a dialectic that's being injected into nature with Bataille. He wants to talk about the solar economy. Groys mentions a kind of end of history thesis in Bataille, which I think is quite funny, and it's not a bad contender for one, where Bataille thinks that actually history does have an end, and it's Harry S. Truman and the Marshall Plan. Like, oh, okay, history is over now. We don't need to go to war with each other, because Bataille's whole thing is ending war, having what he calls dynamic peace. And dynamic peace is the following. Rather than building up production, spending all this money on weapons so that we can waste it, how do we deal with the surplus, all the stuff? We burn it all in war. And he says, well, what instead? Why don't we just make it a global welfare state? Right? Which is, in many ways, quite patronizing. And I mean, if anyone wants to read in something about this, the book we did together, Asafal Compendium with Noah and Vex and Stewart, that has an essay of mine on Bataille on war and comparing his theory of redistributive justice in the economic sphere to Fanon, who is similar but actually pulls it off a lot better. That Bataille is also thinking in terms of these global terms, distribution of waste, of death. They are trying to think new kind of total atheism, which can't quite flee from God, has to confront as the philosopher Sorry, let's say, as the philosopher Dennis Reynolds calls it, the God hole, which some people fill with religion.
Looking at the Kojève-Bataille connection, I was kind of doing some math on it. To me, it's obvious that for both Kojève and Bataille, that they are undertaking a kind of secular theology. Bataille, an explicitly negative theology. I mean, even Kojève as well. But despite that's the case, they both start from very different predicates, where for Kojève, the source of self-consciousness is negation through work, through risk, and ascesis. Work comes in here. Bataille keeps the ascetic part, but only insofar as it pertains to expenditure and consumption, the pursuit of limited experiences, and anything that has the taste of ecstasy. And Kojève is trying to fend off the animality, which he sees as the sort of regressive road back to pre-human history. Whereas for Bataille and sovereignty, that sort of tipping over into animality is important, and the acknowledgement of continuity, as you were pointing to earlier. And then things just like split ever more deeply once we get to Kojève on recognition, and then it's Bataille through enjoyment. But what's interesting to me is Kojève, despite his productivism, and Bataille, despite his expenditurist orientation, I think the one sort of insurmountable obstacle, which is our insurmountable obstacle today, is the tyranny of consumption in the consumer economy for both of them. Bataille gets close to it, but I think he acknowledges that even with the democratization of the kind of consumer enjoyments that we see in the world of the bourgeoisie, that even when we get that in some limited form of like exclusive Blu-ray DVDs, Funko Pops, and anything else, it still doesn't overcome the kinds of problems that he's facing and that we are facing.
Yeah, there's a quote from Kojève where he talks about when he thinks that post-historical existence has already been achieved in the States, and where he sees the socialist nations of the USSR and China going, and he says, actually, these people just want consumer goods as well. I mean,
exactly.
They all want to be as rich as each other. And Kojève is very dispirited by this because he thinks this is a return to animality. He wants us to be maximally self-aware through systems of recognition about our station and our forms in life. But consumerism, I mean, it does do that. It does give you a sense of conspicuous consumption. The idea that, oh, I'm a this guy. What do you smoke? I'm a Marlboro man. Like there are certain recognition mediated through commodities, which I think he's missing there. But also, and I think I was talking about this before. I mean, if history for Kojève is just us sort of trying to solve the problem of our mortality, the more we know we're mortal, the more self-aware we are. We sort of know how to exploit our own ability to embrace our death and trying to go beyond it in every moment. Then consumerism can do that without philosophy. That's kind of the infinite yearning to transcend the finite moment in an encounter with one's own death. I mean, that's just what a cigarette is. It's as Oscar Wilde says. It's Oscar Wilde said you have a momentary pleasure that leaves you completely unsatisfied. So, what more could you want? Like addiction is a new immortality. That is kind of the real defeat of Kojève, because actually, the machinic nature of our desire is not reducible to the Platonic desire to embody an idea of our own humanity. Because despite the fact that humans are dialectical, humans actually don't exist purely for thought. There is an unthought in the human, which is something I've been working on with the Stirner book. The idea that Stirner takes the side of the unthought in human. Because actually, we're already human. We don't necessarily overcome this through positing a higher thought of humanity we're meant to be adequate ourselves to. And it's that in many ways which is on which everything is built upon. Like humans can become bearers of exchange value because there's something about them that isn't exchange value, that isn't even reducible to what's thought of them. There is a kind of base matter, as Bataille would call it, to humanity, which allows them to be put into these grand circuits, which is not built on nothingness. It is nothingness for philosophy, maybe, But it's not nothingness for that which can capitalize upon human beings, because there's, in terms of the field of philosophical anthropology, it's always been it's always been a complete and total failure, especially growing out of Hegel. Like, Marx had to abandon it to get rid of someone like Feuerbach. And I know, listeners, this might become a running theme of me just saying, if I don't like something, it's Feuerbach, like we did in the episode of the Pope. But this is Feuerbachian anthropology. You take an essence of a human being. Like, Feuerbach says, I want to rename Christianity as anthropology and take God out, because God is just the collective being of humanity. Kojève, at one point, I think Groys points out, he says, look, get rid of the theology from Christianity, keep the anthropology. And actually, the collective, for Feuerbach, God was our species being. For Kojève, God is our species death, which we all carry within us. Even though we are not necessarily identical to our own deaths, we are not reducible to it, in the same way that for Feuerbach, we are all part of the species of humanity, but none of us fully embody it. And so it's more like a standard to live up to than it is a thing that we necessarily fully embody. And I think this kind of philosophical anthropology is always going to end up, especially in this sort of cod Hegelian essentialist mode, always going to end up in these rather esoteric, but nonetheless ultimately kind of relatively sort of basic fucking Platonism. Just, okay, oh look, we're doing political Platonism again. Great, fine. Like you can see where someone like, even someone like Nick Landers figured this out. Even him. Like, thinking about that Meltdown text, and he says, the problem with philosophy, it has these platonic top-down solutions. And Kojève has given up on bottom-up solutions at this point, in terms of revolution, because, the man's trying to found the European Union. The most top-down, like, ode to joy bullshit. Like Kojève got what he wanted. It was called Habermas.
And that didn't work. Yeah. In the end, the philosophical anthropology serves to buttress the figure of the human. In the course of this conversation, this image came to mind of just a naked human chomping its way up this licorice stick that's tethered somewhere in the expanse that is heaven. And beneath it, there's just this vacuous abyss that's trying to suck the figure of the human into the bowels of history. But there's consumption on both sides of it. The only way to preserve that figure of the human is by chomping one's way up the licorice stick as the vacuum grows stronger over time. Because that particular image that I've put forward here is structured around a lack, I think that this is the problem of consumption, that in order to maintain the figure of the human, you need to construct the forms of lack. That needs to be there. And the antidote is always going to be something that looks like a form of consumption. And why not its most accelerated form? Why not the form of consumption where one can, in addition to not only being human, have particularized identities? I'm human and I'm also a Francophile. I'm human and I'm a collector of 1970s and 80s Matchbox cars or something like that. And so it's through this cladding of identity, through the mode of consumption, that we offset that possibility of falling into the well of the abyss. I see the juxtaposition of Kojève and Bataille as being potential antidotes to the problem of a kind of infinite consumption presupposed under capitalism and the false promise of the persistence of our identity.
And I think there's an additional thing to point out with Kojève, and if you want to talk about a post-historical situation in terms of humans having nothing within themselves or having a death in themselves, we've become the sort of species that is better at doing damage to itself, better at negating itself, without necessarily even knowing it, or it coming to a kind of self-awareness. Like, I don't know if anyone's noticed, it's been really fucking hot the past few months. Everyone's really noticed that. Like, there is something there of this appeal to a higher second nature, of a form of humanity, which is, why does the category of human have to be informative? Especially for the philosophical way, in terms of like, vocational destiny for human beings. I don't know why it has to be. Like, what does your ethical disposition do when it changes in regards to whether something's a human? Does it come to a capacity of, I'm not going to say capacity of pain and pleasure, because that's just utilitarian sort of bollocks, but
Well, it
as
is
soon as you
interesting.
create this standard, do you not just simply recreate the possibility of dehumanization? You're like, I mean, this is why he wants a Latin empire, because he wants people to bank their humanity in an imperialist form. It's the same thing that we talked about with Catholicism the episode before. It's you are banking your humanity in the empire. Recognition is banked. It's a currency. Recognition is essentially a currency.
And I think if we want to talk about the climate change piece as it pertains to the solidity of the human, the figure of humanity as it is operative today is operative almost solely in the service of self-preservation, of the maintenance of its durability and its composite identities amidst the ever-growing threat of its dissolution. And I mean, from a Nietzschean standpoint, this is pretty much the worst thing that we can do. I don't think the Nietzschean standpoint offers us a particular solution in the concrete, but in the abstract, it gives us a sort of lens through which to view how our problem is taking shape.
I mean, there's a quote I actually want to read out from the Groys biography, which is something that really grabbed me because it feels almost Trotskyist in how Kojève is putting this together. But what I mean is he has like a state capitalist thesis about Stalinism, right? And in terms of recognition we get, and I think it's a recognition which could apply to states that aren't necessarily Soviet in that sense. So, quote, "The socialist state is not interested in an additional legitimization through war because it already has its own legitimization as an employer. The socialist states, that means the working state, should strive to establish an empire. This empire, the World Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, will become only possible after revolution in every nation state. The empire that will emerge as a result of these revolutions will be a working empire, and as such, it will be immune from internal class wars and external wars because it will unite all of humankind." Now, I think in terms of like the abolition of class struggle, the attempt to abolish class struggle, the legitimacy of the employer has been completely superseded by the legitimacy of the owner, or even the legitimacy of the fucking consumer. Like, in terms of trying to eliminate class wars, or at least in terms of internal legitimacy, this isn't particularly new. I kind of think in many ways his vision of the Soviet state, I don't see why it wouldn't also apply to certain neoliberal states today. I mean, states no longer legitimate themselves through, well, I say that. The United States has essentially had to revert to legitimizing itself through war for other states. I think internally, externally, even the Soviet Union had to do this. And that's why it requires a revolution in other states for them to join the empire. But this idea of internal political legitimacy as based on an employer, this is just a reinvigoration of the national project. You are a national stakeholder, a national worker. I mean, I do wonder as well, because Kojève has a critique of fascism. He thinks it's too nationalistic and therefore cannot compete with the international sort of conglomerates of revolution and internationalism as its ideals. But it's hard to think that, apart from the fact he thinks it's philosophically quite stupid, why he wouldn't have been amenable to a certain kind of fascism if it was going to preserve a certain kind of mutual recognition. Like an authoritarian traditionalist state, I don't see why he wouldn't be, especially if the legitimacy of the state is a national employer or an international employer. Like, does Amazon count as a socialist world republic? Like in this case, it is so philosophically abstract that I just have to wonder what else. Like, if he published this shit, people would have told him he was wrong. I kind of wonder why he didn't publish this stuff.
Well, not to be too glib about it, but there are certain countries on the continent of Europe that have thrived more and better as neoliberal states than they did as fascist ones, and those are the same countries.
I mean, pretty much that's why as we argued last episode, neoliberal states do not entirely need fascist government to achieve the ends of fascists and fascist operators.
So to that extent,
maybe it's kind of try it, just we'd be like, oh damn, Kojève, Mr. Explicitly not a Marxist. Why weren't you a Marxist? I mean, basically, if anything, it tells you sort of the problems of trying to achieve a revolutionary emancipation of human beings from destitution purely through the vectors of Hegelianism and like Gnosticism and Platonism. We are doing critique of idealism ultimately here. Even a kind of, we are doing kind of atheistic idealism. This is an atheistic idealism. And we're not saying that Therefore, you should just go be a Marxist in the most boring, dry way possible, because it obviously needs a bit more juicing than that, because it hasn't necessarily worked the best in previous years. I mean, that's why we end up getting things like Stalin in the first place. All other factors are involved. But I do think this is a great spot to critique political idealism and sort of the pretensions of a certain kind of philosophical mindset. I do think he should have published more, because I think people would have gone, well, hold up. This is like the manuscript about Stalin was left. It was 1,000 pages. It was left to Bataille, because as people used to leave Bataille things, basically, if you was going to leg it from the Nazis in France, you would give your manuscript to Bataille, because he worked in the library. He knew where to hide it, right? Yeah. And those fuckers weren't going to get it. They didn't get the Arcades Project by Walter Benjamin. They did not get not if the Nazis were going to look for these manuscripts in much detail, but they were saved for us by the work of Bataille. Bataille was a sort of a fence in many ways for literary manuscripts from escaping sort of philosophers, I guess, relatively leftist. But I do think this sort of shows that it's very hard these days to come up with, and even in those days, to come up with an emancipatory philosophy purely from philosophy itself. Kojève, even as an anarchist or as a Marxist, there would be something that was missing purely from the limits, because he was constantly trying to locate the end of history. He kept trying to interpret the world, let's say. And then only sort of towards the end of his life, he's like, fuck it, I'm going to try and change it. And then he tries to, and then he goes to invent the EU with a few other guys. But not great. I mean, I'm not going to do like a philosopher's Brexit here or anything, but it's turned the Mediterranean into a mass grave. That's what I'll say about the European Union.
So what should our coda be to this episode on Kojève? The one thing that interested me, I was going to bail on the last chapters of the book because my reading of it was riding right up on the edge of us recording this. I'm like, I probably don't have to read the last couple of pages or chapters, which actually turned out to be some of the most interesting among them, particularly chapter 17, the visualization of logos, which is a fantastic name for the chapter and a way to sort of put a visual image, a stamp, as it were, on Kojève's legacy. And what I found fascinating was Groys' poetic cast of Kojève's life as a photographer and a traveler, somebody who went to different places in the world and began taking pictures. Interestingly, Kojève never printed these pictures in any sort of mass-produced sort of way. They were just all one-offs, essentially. And I think they are now in the French National Library. But what was interesting was he went around collecting thousands of postcards too, in addition to taking these photographs. And there's a really beautiful paragraph that I think should be read out to sort of give a picture of Kojève's life through the metaphor of postcards. Groys writes, Kojève put all his postcards in boxes and arranged them in a way that reflected the travels he undertook in his function as a political dignitary during the years 1959 to 1968, mostly in Europe and Asia. In the boxes that contained his postcards, Kojève also placed self-made cards, the same size as postcards, on which he traced the itineraries of the travels during which he had collected postcards and taken photographs. In general, one can argue that the art collection not only presents images for our gaze, but also demonstrates the framing of their presentation, the mode in which the gaze of the spectator is determined, oriented, and manipulated by the collector. The collection is not merely selective. It exhibits its own selectivity. The collection exhibits itself before it exhibits anything else. A worldview is a technologically created illusion, but Kojève's collection and its arrangement show precisely how this illusion is produced and presented. And I just think this is a sort of interesting vignette for the philosopher bureaucrat that we see as Kojève, as somebody whose insistence on form, inventory, and category has its expression in his life as a hobbyist of sorts. And as I understand it, it's almost as if the postcard images that he took, or the photographs that could serve as postcards, had this sort of kitschy quality to them. This is the sort of thing. This is you taking the picture like on the painted X in front of Mount Fuji sort of vibes, just going around the world and finding the most anodyne but iconic touristy image one can imagine, and just grabbing thousands of those.
Yeah, it is quite, it's like a quietism towards the end. I mean, this is what Groys ends the book on, with the idea of the sage. The sage is something he originally gives it the title to Hegel. Groys says that the sage is just someone who can ultimately just contemplate the desire to go beyond oneself, to go beyond, as he calls it, desire not to be human, to encounter one's own transition into death. And that Groys basically ends the book by saying that this is just him trying to portray that through the movement of words and images in terms of the creation of objects to be left behind to mark that there at least was a philosopher here. And I've been kind of harsh on Kojève, but there's a nice quote towards the end of the book where Stalin is, of course, mentioned. So, I had to sort of zoom in on that a second. Because Groys says that you can't become an artist or a philosopher if you're not, in heart, an anarchist. And what he means by that is that believing that everybody could be an artist or a philosopher. And he thinks that Kojève ultimately is kind of an anarchist at heart because he thinks that, like Stirner, the individual is nothingness, although I would say that being in nothingness for philosophy and being in nothingness outside of that regime of humanization is different and not in the same way that Stirner wants to talk about it. But that's kind of a niche point. But he also kind of ends with this kind of reassertion that Kojève did believe that society should be made up of autonomous individuals who can sort of give themselves their own laws, who can essentially become philosophically self-legislating. Almost, I mean, it sounds anarchist, but I think it's easily Kantian. But he just didn't think we would live in that society, and he thinks that ultimately we need to find a form of society that will achieve that. I just think that ultimately there was a failure to achieve that on your own, because it's much like philosophy. You can't really do this shit on your own. It makes it seem like that. And he did this in a sense as well, because he did seminars, courses, but he only did the fucking Hegel courses because he lost all of his money investing in Laughing Cow cheese. Like, there was not much of a collective thing here. It was very private. And I think his private philosophy in many ways feels like his attempt to hold his own death within himself. He was a very anally retentive philosopher. Whereas Bataille was just quite famously the exact opposite, just this spewing out of philosophical creativity in both esoteric and exoteric forms, but nonetheless something which was designed to come out, to be put into light, to be put into kind of practice. And I think there's some missed opportunities of Kojève's work here. Maybe he was the last philosopher of the 20th century who was still working on this Platonic model, and that's why he's still such an engaging, in many ways, fascinating figure.
And I'll just end by saying that I don't really recommend that you become a Hegelian. But if you do, I would apply the same maxim that one would apply to Christmas in the United States. It's best to keep Christ in Christmas. And I think if you become a Hegelian, maybe keep a little Jesus in there. Then you don't have to do this decades-long runaround and get back to theology through your secular atheology.
If you keep the Christ in Hegel, you can just be philosophically racist the old-fashioned way. It's like those old New York diners that still use Coke with the syrup. They use Hegel with Jesus and then still come back to a kind of Eurocentric essentialism, which makes nobody happy, that makes certain people feel at the very least quite smart.